Enid Blyton, the most comforting children's books ever. Although her books evoke a particular time in Britain, Enid Blyton has found an unexpected following in India. On the 125th anniversary of the author's birth, Kamala Thiagarajan discovers what draws people to her work. On a rainy, windswept morning in August 2021, in the western Indian city of Pune, Alicia Purander, 35, a former German language tutor and parenting blogger, witnessed a rather heart-melting sight. Her 74-year-old mother-in-law and her 8-year-old daughter were sitting shoulder to shoulder on a sofa, reading in companionable silence. They were immersed in a world of mystery books written by the British author Enid Blyton. For Purander, who owns a vast collection of 300 books authored by Blyton and describes herself as a superfan, it was a special moment. She's been hooked on Blyton since the age of 6, when she received her first 2 paperbacks, possibly pirated versions of A Famous Five and The Folk of the Faraway Tree, as a gift from her uncle. It didn't surprise her that her mother-in-law, a native Marathi speaker, who rarely read other English-language books, still enjoyed Blyton. That's the power and magic that Blyton wields in India, Purander says. Long before the era of Harry Potter, Enid Blyton was a phenomenon, a worldwide best-selling author since the 1930s, with more than 600 million copies in circulation and over 800 titles translated into 90 languages. In India, especially, her popularity soared. An entire generation of Indians grew up on a steady diet of Blyton in the 80s and 90s, especially at a time when there were few other children's books available and libraries tended to stock more British authors than any other nationality. Even today, there's a thriving demand and brisk trade in Enid Blyton across India. Blyton is one of the few author brands whose work remains unshakable, says Thomas Abraham, the managing director of Hachette, India. The UK division of Hachette owns worldwide rights to distribute Blyton's books. She's still the third largest selling children's author in India in any present year, after recent sensations J.K. Rowling and Jeff Kinney. But if you were to consider her sales across all her books from over 70 years, I'm pretty certain she would probably be the largest selling author, period. Because even today, her top series Famous Five, which celebrates its 80th birthday this year, sells over 250,000 copies, with The Secret Seven topping 100,000 copies year on year. Though these two are the author's strongest sellers, Abraham says that Blyton has several other hits such as her school series, Mallory Towers, St. Clair's, Naughtiest Girl, Mystery Adventures, The Five Find Outers, the Adventure series, the Secret series, the Barney R. Mystery series, the Adventurous Four, To the Family and Farm Adventures, Willow, Cherry Tree, Mistletoe. Younger readers are drawn to her series, from Amelia Jane to The Faraway Tree. She was by far one of the most prolific writers in the world, says Abraham. Apart from the clean, wholesome, value-educating appeal, her enduring popularity here is threefold. First, there's nostalgia, as most parents start their kids off on Blyton reliving their own childhoods. Then there's the storytelling itself, from mystery and adventure to food feasts. And thirdly, she's of course still seen as one of the best English tutors in the world, and in India that's key to getting ahead. Roxanne Naranha from Mumbai, who grew up loving Blyton's books as a child, has tapped into that appeal. In June 2021, Naranha created a WhatsApp group to sell off the many books she's collected from childhood. It was a life-changing move, she says, and it helped her connect to Blyton lovers not just across India, but Asia as well. Today, she's made a career out of trading in Blyton and chasing down rare editions for collectors. I've hunted down Blyton books piled up with second-hand dealers in dusty, narrow lanes, chanced upon reading nooks in neighborhood restaurants and cafes, and in old run-down local libraries. Finding a new edition and sharing it with like-minded collectors is an adventure and a joy, she says. So far, she's sold more than 500 books, a mix of paperbacks and rare first editions. A rocky road. Naranha is aware that Blyton's success didn't come without its fair share of speed bumps. Blyton once famously said that she didn't concern herself with criticism by readers over 12, a statement with which I wholeheartedly agree, she says. Over the years, however, criticism for the author has been building in her native country. English Heritage noted how in 1960, Macmillan refused to publish Blyton's novel The Mystery That Never Was, because of a faint but unattractive touch of old-fashioned xenophobia. It would go on to be published by HarperCollins. In 2019, the Royal Mint had proposed to put Enid Blyton's image on a 50-pence coin to commemorate the 50th anniversary of her death, but those plans were cancelled out of concerns over her outdated views on race and gender. I grew up reading about potted meat sandwiches for picnics, scones for tea, and yearned to see snowdrops and buttercups. Sandip Roy. Blyton's fans in India aren't blind to her faults. The author colonized young Indian minds far more easily than the British East India Company, says novelist and radio commentator Sandip Roy, who defended Blyton in a 2019 op-ed for one of India's national papers, The Mint, even as he agreed with her critics. The amazing thing about Blyton is how it shaped not just our childhoods, but an entire trajectory of our reading, starting from when we first began to read as children, with the Nada series, well into our teens, with the Mallory Towers and the famous Five Adventures, says Roy. Very few children's writers could cover that much ground during one's growing years, and that's why her influence was so oversized, he feels. In a 2021 essay for the Times of India, Roy wrote, Blyton's greatest accomplishment as a writer might have been not in her home country of England but in the spell she cast over its former colonies, especially India. She colonized us with crumpets and make-believe. An unexpected outcome of this steady diet of Blyton were the larger-than-life impressions of England that it painted for Indian readers. Blyton even made bland English food sound utterly delicious, says Roy. I grew up reading about potted meat sandwiches for picnics, scones for tea, and yearned to see snowdrops and buttercups, only to go to England in my late teens and to find all of that quite underwhelming, he says. However, Blyton did fill his childhood years with excitement and a sense of adventure. He loved the fact that children in her books had agency. They ran away from home, could take trips on their own, living in hollow trees and woods or camping in caves. It was worlds apart from the very sheltered upbringing I had in Kolkata, he says. Reading Blyton as an adult, says Purander, was a very different experience. She couldn't overlook the many disturbing references that she'd failed to see as a child. It wasn't until last year, when she started collecting dust wrapper editions from the 1960s, that she realized how much Enid Blyton's books have been sanitized, with offensive and racist slurs changed by publishers over the years. Some of these changes are entirely justified, she says. For instance, the book The Three Gollywogs tells the story of three of these dolls, named after offensive, racist slurs. The dust wrapper editions of these books published in 1968 and 1973 still retain those names. In the subsequent editions of these paperbacks, these terms were sponged away, says Purander. By completely wiping out any of the references that we feel may be politically incorrect, we're preventing deeper discussions about these prejudices that it could spark in young readers. Alicia Purander. Exploring older editions and comparing them to more modern ones, Purander began to find that many of these omissions were based on gender. In the 90s edition of the standalone novel The Family at Red Roofs, an entire passage is missing, she says. It's about the instructions that a father, who is about to go on a trip, gives to his young son, when he leaves him in charge of the household. He has an older daughter, but he doesn't rely on her. There's a lot of casual sexism, in spite of Enid Blyton having created the character George, the star of the famous Five, who was seen as a rebel and who rejects the tropes of gender, Purander notes. Blyton did patronize women in her books a lot while playing up to populist sentiment on gender. She reinforces how a woman is supposed to be a primary caregiver, how the household falls apart without a woman at home, an irony when Blyton herself was a successful career woman who did no caretaking of her own, she says. But expunging the books of these flaws prevents the reader from discussing them and seeing authors as a product of their times. By completely wiping out any of the references that we feel may be politically incorrect, we're preventing deeper discussions about these prejudices that it could spark in young readers, says Purander. One critique that grew over the years was that her books clearly lacked brown and black characters. Those that were there were often looked down upon, like the gypsies in the famous 5 series, who were made out to be undesirable and petty thieves. If her books had brown and Indian characters, we would have perhaps been more aware of the racist undertones, says Roy. In India at the time, we were hardly aware of race politics and thought nothing of the lily-white nature of our books. And for many readers, the adventure mattered more than anything else, and it was what they consciously chose to focus on, he says. A current generation of readers, however, is bound to be more aware. Her books gave me so much pleasure, transporting me into worlds where mysteries were solved, adventures were experienced and fantastical settings were explored. I think it's the escapism that grabbed me really and that made me a reader. Sophia Ahmed. Bridging that void now is British-Indian author Sophia Ahmed, who has been commissioned by Hachette to make the famous 5 more inclusive for South Asian readers. Ahmed was born in Gujarat, and raised in Bolton and London. She first began reading Blyton as a child in the 80s, she says, when all the problematic references had already been removed. Her books gave me so much pleasure, transporting me into worlds where mysteries were solved, adventures were experienced and fantastical settings were explored. I think it's the escapism that grabbed me really and that made me a reader, she says. It also made her dream of being a writer. Today, I'm just making the setting for the famous 5's adventures more reflective of the world that young readers live in, without changing the essence of their appeal. The 5 still love the countryside and the coast, go camping on their island, and are good-hearted children who help their friends and neighbors and of course are devoted to Timmy the dog, but the new adventures are more reflective of modern times, she says. The settings for the famous 5 adventures are now more diverse, with more people of color in Kiran village, where they live. The first book in series, Timmy and Treasure, was released in January. The second story she's written, 5 and the Runaway Dog, released in May this year, introduces Simi, a girl of South Asian heritage, and her family who have moved into the village. Simi plays a major part in the story and is also featured on the front cover. The third book, 5 and the Message in a Bottle, an upcoming release slated for May 2023, includes a police chief of Nigerian heritage. A girl in a hijab is featured in images and as a village resident. Another author, Jacqueline Wilson, has written a new story for the Magic Faraway Tree series, addressing some of the gender prejudices of the original. The book, which was published in May, retains the characters of the Faraway Tree that readers know and love: Moonface, Silky the Fairy and Saucepan Man, and introduces new characters Milo, Mia, and Birdie. In the revised editions, among other subtle changes, the girls aren't the only ones helping with domestic chores, and Milo is a boy with longish hair who often wears pink. The rewritten famous 5 books have been received well by young audiences, and not just in the UK, but Spain and Portugal, too, says Ahmed. My readers see the Britain they are familiar with, one that is multicultural and inclusive, she says. Though Blyton is still popular in India, she doesn't hold a cultural monopoly over young minds. Indian authors and publishers have long catered to young children, and children's book publishing in the country is going through a revolution, as publishers experiment by translating into different Indian languages and exploring new subjects. The Delhi-based Children's Book Trust, a pioneer in children's publishing that has been operating for 60 years, now reaches hundreds of readers in India's remote rural villages. Pritham Books, a non-profit publisher in India, has been producing engaging children's stories since 2004, which have been translated into 21 Indian languages, including 4 tribal languages. The award-winning Duckbill, acquired by Penguin Random House, has published books about Indian characters such as Chunky in Chunky and the Elephants, a story of how a young girl learns more about the wild animals who are so much a part of her home. These are books about children from different cultural backgrounds even within India, giving children a peek into the lives of kids who are so different from them, and yet, so alike in many ways, says the author of Chunky, Leslie Denise Biswas. When books are written by diverse authors, their personal experiences are invaluable. And yet, Blyton still has the power to overcome her critics and to transfix, as Purander discovered on that August morning, when her daughter Rumi spent long, happy hours reading with her grandmother. It made me nostalgic, she says. Growing up, it was all I ever did with my pocket money, invested in buying more books by Blyton. So, it made sense to me that Blyton was able to transcend any generational gap to be so loved and read at all ages. Princess Mononoke, the masterpiece that flummoxed the US. 25 years old this week, the film is Japanese animation master Hayao Miyazaki's most complex work. But how it was mishandled in the West speaks of fundamental artistic differences, writes Stephen Kelly. In 1997, the British fantasy author Neil Gaiman received a call out of the blue from then-head of Miramax, Harvey Weinstein. This animated film, Princess Mononoke, Gaiman recalls him saying, "It's the biggest thing in Japan right now. So I thought I've got to get the best to do it. I called Quentin Tarantino and said, 'Quentin, will you do the English language script?' And he said, 'You don't want me, you want Gaiman. So, I'm calling you.'" Miramax, a then subsidiary of Disney, had acquired the rights to distribute Princess Mononoke, the newest film from Japanese animation studio Studio Ghibli, in the United States, and Weinstein wanted to fly Gaiman to Los Angeles to watch a cut of the movie. "I had zero plans to do it," Gaiman tells BBC Culture. "But the moment that changed everything for me was the scene where you're looking at this large pebble. And then a raindrop hits it. And then another raindrop hits it. And then another raindrop hits it. And now it's raining and the surface is slippery and wet. And I'm like, I have never seen anything like this. This is real filmmaking. This is David Lean level filmmaking. This is Akira Kurosawa level filmmaking. This is the real deal." When Princess Mononoke was first released in Japan on July 12, 1997, 25 years ago this week, it represented something of a departure for master animator and director Hayao Miyazaki. During the late 80s, Miyazaki had built his reputation, along with the success of Studio Ghibli, which he founded with fellow director Isao Takahata, on films like Kiki's Delivery Service and My Neighbor Totoro, formally ambitious, thematically rich works, but generally affirming in tone and family-friendly in nature. But something changed during the 90s. Firstly, he began to bristle at the popular idea that Studio Ghibli only makes gentle movies about how great nature is. "I begin to hear of Ghibli as sweet or healing," he grumbles in Princess Mononoke, How the Film Was Conceived, a 6-hour documentary about the film's production, and I get an urge to destroy it. Yet even more significant was his growing despair at a world which he had increasingly come to believe was cursed. He used to be what he called leftist in sympathy, a believer in people power, explains Shiro Yoshioka, lecturer in Japanese studies at Newcastle University. But for obvious reasons, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the escalation in ethnic conflicts across Europe, his political beliefs were totally shaken in the early 1990s. Japan itself was also going through something of an existential crisis. The country's bubble period, an economic boom during the late 80s, burst in 1992, stranding Japan in a seemingly endless recession. 3 years later, in 1995, the country was hit by the Kobe earthquake, the worst earthquake to hit Japan since 1922. It killed 6,000 people, and destroyed the homes of tens of thousands more. Only 2 months after that, a terrorist cult by the name of Aum Shinrikyo launched a sarin gas attack on the Tokyo metro, killing 13 and injuring thousands. Miyazaki, who was sickened by the materialism of the bubble period, was now living in a country traumatized and confused both by its relationship with nature, and a creeping sense of spiritual emptiness. He began to think, says Yoshioka, maybe I should not make this entertaining, light-hearted stuff for children. Maybe I should make something substantial. A new anger. Set during the 14th century, the Muromachi period of Japan, Princess Mononoke tells the story of Ashitaka, a young prince cursed by the hatred of a dying boar god, who has been corrupted by an iron ball lodged in his body. "Hear me, loathsome humans," the boar says, "You shall know my agony and my hatred." To seek a cure for his curse, Ashitaka travels across the land, hoping to find the Shishigami, a deer-like forest spirit with the power to bring life and death. Along the way, Ashitaka discovers a world out of balance. The ironworks community of Tatara, run by the enigmatic Lady Eboshi, is ravaging the nearby forest for resources, provoking the wrath of ferocious wolf god Moro and her feral human daughter San, the titular Mononoke, which roughly translates to spectre or wraith. Caught in the middle is Ashitaka, who must figure out how to navigate this difficult world with eyes unclouded. "I always loved that phrase," says Gaiman. "Unclouded by evil. Unclouded by fear, unclouded by hate. You just have to see what's actually there." Compared to Miyazaki's previous work, it is a dark and angry film, full of strange spectacle and scenes of startling violence. Hands are severed. Heads are cut off. Blood gushes from both human and animal alike. "I believe that violence and aggression are essential parts of us as human beings," Miyazaki once told journalist Roger Ebert. "The issue that we confront as human beings is how to control that impulse. I know that small children may watch this film, but I intentionally chose not to shield them from the violence that resides in human beings." Indeed, the cursed boar god, whose anger bursts out of him like a writhing nest of oily worms, was inspired by Miyazaki's own struggle to control his rage. Hayao Miyazaki is a self-confessed bundle of contradictions. Read his writings, listen to his interviews, watch him speak, and he paints a portrait of an artist caught between idealism and nihilism, optimism and despair. He is the pacifist with a fascination for warplanes, the demanding boss who despises authority, yet, as a director, wields it ruthlessly, the father who believes passionately in the spirit of children but was hardly home to raise his own, the staunch environmentalist who struggles to live an ecologically ethical life. "When I see tuna being hauled in on a line I think, wow, humans are terrible," he once told Japanese author Tetsuo Yamauri in 2002, in an interview republished in the 2014 Miyazaki essay anthology Turning Point. "But when someone offers me tuna sashimi, I of course eat it and it tastes delicious." This idea of a man at war with himself is obvious to see in the characters and world of Princess Mononoke, a film that, as Miyazaki told a press conference at the Berlin Film Festival in 1998, was not made to judge good and evil. Take Lady Eboshi, whose mining colony is manufacturing an arsenal of guns to use against the forest gods. In most animated movies, she would be cast as the greedy, villainous scourge of nature. But Eboshi is also a generous leader, someone who has liberated women, implied to be former sex workers, from feudalistic oppression, who has provided a safe haven for leprosy sufferers and outcasts, and whose industrialization work is raising the standards of human life. It would have been so easy to have a technology is bad versus the good beasts of the forest story, says Susan Napier, professor of the Japanese program at Tufts University, Massachusetts, and author of Miyazaki World, A Life in Art. But the foundry helps these marginalized people live. It gives them jobs, a source of community, pride. Speaking in 1997 to Cinefurontasha magazine, Miyazaki himself once rationalized Lady Eboshi with often, "Those who are destroying nature are in reality people of good character. People who are not evil diligently take actions thinking they are for the best, but the results can lead to terrible problems." With Studio Ghibli you have a sense that, contrary to the Judeo-Christian Western point of view, humans are not necessarily the dominant creatures in the world. Susan Napier. Such moral ambiguity is not only extended to the film's human characters. The wolf god Moro is as tender as she is savage, while the natural world itself is not presented as a purely virtuous force, but one capable of stupidity and horror. Okoto, leader of the Boar clan, stubbornly charges into battle against the superior forces of mankind, foolishly dooming his race. Meanwhile the cold, uncanny visage of the Shishigami, who during the day resembles a great deer, suggests a side of nature that refuses to be anthropomorphized into something comforting, that is instead unsettling and strange, indifferent to whether you live or die. With Studio Ghibli, says Napier, you have a sense that, contrary to the Judeo-Christian Western point of view, humans are not necessarily the dominant creatures in the world. It's an ethos with arguable roots in Japan's history of ecological disasters, and in Shintoism, the animistic folk religion of Japan, based around the faith that there is a spirit in all things. Writing in 2006, in promotional material for a new short film, Miyazaki states that, I am much more attracted to the idea of preserving the forests, not for the sake of humans, but because they themselves are alive. In the words of Yoshioka, he believes that we should not protect nature just because it's useful, or try to control it. Instead, we should respect nature as something which has agency of its own. This belief is perhaps encapsulated best in a scene in Princess Mononoke described by Napier as the Sistine Chapel of animation. It is the sequence in which a group of hunters, led by the opportunistic monk Jigo, catch a glimpse of the Shishigami in the huge, translucent form it takes after sunset. Miyazaki's films are invariably beautiful, drawn and animated with an obsessive attention to detail, and painted with the kind of clarity and depth that can make you look at the world with new eyes, like falling in love, or coming close to death. The Shishigami, however, is quite different. It looms over the forest like a walking night sky, inspiring both awe and terror alike. It is not cuddly and cute, says Napier. It looks other and scary. Then it starts to transform and you see these little Kadama creatures, tiny tree spirits, whose faces are fixed with impish smiles, look on in wonder. It is a sublime moment that has nothing to do with human beings. Very different receptions. Princess Mononoke was a sensation in Japan. It grossed over 19 billion yen, $160 million, at the box office, far outstripping the country's previous record holder, Steven Spielberg's E.T., and launched Miyazaki to new heights of fame and influence. The film's themes of unrest, which Miyazaki himself had doubted would translate into entertainment, had obviously struck a chord with Japanese society. Although its success can equally be attributed to a deft marketing campaign orchestrated by producer Toshio Suzuki, who had also made a deal with the Walt Disney Corporation to distribute Studio Ghibli's movies worldwide, including a dubbed theatrical release of Princess Mononoke in the US. The film itself was considered too mature to be released under the Disney banner. Instead, it was passed on to Disney subsidiary Miramax, headed by Harvey Weinstein, the now jailed producer who had a reputation for taking art films from abroad and cutting them in such a way that appealed to the domestic market, as he saw it, at least. The contract that Studio Ghibli had signed with Disney, however, came with a strict condition: Princess Mononoke, which had a runtime of just over 2 hours, could not be cut in any way, shape, or form. It was a clause that would prove contentious. In his memoir Sharing a House with the Never-Ending Man, about his time working at Studio Ghibli helping to sell the films to the West, film executive Steve Alpert recalls a moment when Suzuki presented Weinstein with a perfect replica of a Japanese samurai sword. He then, in front of a horrified conference room of Miramax employees, shouted in English and in a loud voice, "Mononoke Heim, no cut." The process of making an English-language version of Princess Mononoke that everyone was happy with was tumultuous. Neil Gaiman, who adapted the Japanese script, recalls being caught in a peculiar cleft stick between the demands of Miramax and Studio Ghibli. "You were dealing with one film company in America where everybody was very literal," says Gaiman. "And one film company in Japan, where being literal was the furthest thing from anybody's mind." Gaiman recalls a particular meeting with Miramax where they seemed to struggle with the concept of an animated film that didn't hold the audience's hand. They wanted to know whether Lady Eboshi was a good guy or a bad guy, whether the Shishigami was a good god or a bad god. "Miyazaki built a film in which there are no bad guys," he says. "There are only consequences. Lady Eboshi is providing shelter for sex workers and people with leprosy, but the results of what she's doing is throwing everything off balance. You've got all of that, and meanwhile you've got Miramax going, how will we know Ashitaka is a prince? He doesn't live in a palace." And I'm like, because he's Prince Ashitaka. There were also other clashes. As detailed in Alpert's book, Miramax wanted to add their own sound effects to the film, claiming that there were moments so quiet and still that American audience members would think the cinema's sound had malfunctioned. These included butterflies that made twinkly sounds as they fluttered their wings and, to quote Alpert, the sound of a cloud passing. They were vetoed. Gaiman's script, meanwhile, went through various drafts, but the version that ended up being recorded first by a U.S. voice cast that included Claire Danes and Billy Bob Thornton was by someone whose job was to make sure the words aligned with the characters' mouth movements. Instead, says Gaiman, they took it upon themselves to do a whole script rewrite. And it was that version that was screened for a test audience and booed. By the time the error was discovered, voice director Jack Fletcher was only able to re-record just over half of the script. This has always been a problem when we try to export Japanese animation to the States, because they have this mindset that animation is for children, it has to be dumbed down. Shiro Yoshioka. Princess Mononoke did not perform particularly well in the United States, grossing just $2.3 million domestically. There is a popular idea that this was because a U.S. audience raised on the broad, all-singing, all-dancing animations of Disney were simply not ready for a film like Princess Mononoke. It's an opinion that Miyazaki arguably shares himself. In 1988, he gave a lecture on Japanese animation that included the line, "There are few barriers to entry into animated films. They will invite anyone in, but the barriers to exit must be high and purifying. The barrier to both the entry and exit of Disney films is too low and too wide. To me, they show nothing but contempt for the audience. America still has a very Manichaean binary value system: good, evil, black, white, and it's baked into the Disney formula," says Napier. They usually end with a romance, everyone lives happily ever after, and that's a fundamental part of the American dream. Whereas Japanese culture is more based on a sense of impermanence. There's a cycle and a feeling that you have to enjoy what you have. It's not necessarily a bad world, but it's a complicated world. This has always been a problem when we try to export Japanese animation to the States, adds Yoshioka. Because they have this mindset that animation is for children, possibly born out of its association with Saturday morning cartoons, it has to be dumbed down. In the 1980s, when Miyazaki's Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind was exported to the States, it was turned into a very simple story of good vs evil, and Miyazaki was infuriated by that. That's why he insists now that nothing should be changed when it's exported to the States. Gaiman, however, is not entirely convinced by those arguments. "I don't think I came away thinking, okay. Huge gulf between America and Japan. What I came to the conclusion of was that there is a huge gulf between what Mr. Miyazaki is doing and American commercial filmmaking." Instead, Gaiman thinks that everything that went wrong with Princess Mononoke came down to Harvey Weinstein being petty. He tells a story of how, after the film's first official screening at the New York Film Festival, Weinstein informed Gaiman that he planned to renege on Disney's deal not to cut the film. He said, "We need to cut 40 minutes from it." I said, "Harvey, you lost that battle before the film came to you. You contractually cannot cut a frame." He said, "Yeah, still needs to be 90 minutes. I'm going to tell Mr. Miyazaki tonight, he's going to agree." This was at a celebration dinner at a Cuban restaurant. As Gaiman recalls, Weinstein told Miyazaki and Suzuki the news while they were smoking outside. "Mr. Miyazaki and Mr. Suzuki do not return," says Gaiman. I ask Harvey what they had said. He replies, "Well, they said no, but they'll change their mind. Tomorrow the New York Times review is going to come out and say it's too long. And then they will listen to me. I think if Princess Mononoke had gone out in the US to the people who like foreign films, who like Japanese culture, animation fans, horror fans, it actually could have kindled into a phenomenon." Neil Gaiman. The New York Times review, written by Janet Maslin, called Princess Mononoke a landmark feat of Japanese animation, with images, such as plants and flowers springing to life beneath the Shishigami's hooves, that are simple, meaningful, and ravishingly presented. Nowhere is it mentioned that the film is too long. And all of a sudden, says Gaiman. The next thing I hear is that the fancy launch and giant marketing rollout for Princess Mononoke that had been planned was not going to happen. It was going to roll out in 10 cities with no particular advertising push behind it. Harvey didn't even show up for the premiere in Hollywood. I don't see any reason why Princess Mononoke couldn't have been released and done really well, continues Gaiman. But you would have had to send people out there to explain what this was. He cites the marketing campaign for the film adaptation of his children's book Coraline, which was projected to make $6 million on its opening weekend, but made $16 million. And the reason that happened is because we had a PR company who decided to target lots of small little groups, not just parents with kids. I look at Mononoke and think if they'd gone out to the people who like foreign films, who like Japanese culture, animation fans, horror fans, it actually could have kindled into a phenomenon. Why it's more relevant than ever. The relative failure of Princess Mononoke's US release left Disney lacking confidence in the success of future Studio Ghibli releases. The then head of Pixar, John Lasseter, disagreed however, and took over the US release of Miyazaki's next film, 2001's Spirited Away. Lasseter had been a long-time champion of Miyazaki, and once wrote of how he had inspired him to slow down the action in films like A Bug's Life and Toy Story 2. And yet, despite proving another record-breaking hit in Japan, grossing $304 million, and the English-language version being directed by Beauty and the Beast's Kirk Wise, it barely broke $10 million in the United States. It did however win the second-ever Academy Award for Best Animated Feature. Shrek won the first, although Miyazaki refused to attend the ceremony in protest at the Iraq War. Princess Mononoke would open a naughtier, more socially conscious chapter in the work of Hayao Miyazaki. 2004's Howl's Moving Castle, for example, built on Miyazaki's Oscar protest with an anti-war story inspired by the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, while his most recent film, 2013's The Wind Rises, was a largely fictitious biography of Jiro Horikoshi, who sees his new aircraft design turned into the Mitsubishi A-5M fighter plane, used by Japan during World War II. The two films, ostensibly a challenge to market for Disney, each grossed around $5 million in the US. Princess Mononoke is more relevant now than it has ever been, says Neil Gaiman. We went through years of people going, this climate stuff is going to be a huge problem. And now suddenly we're starting to see the results and it's like, okay, we really are out of whack here and it's only going to get worse. And now what do we do? How do we survive? We're like the people trying to figure it out down in Iron Town. Except we're not really taking as much care of the sex workers and the people with leprosy. But what makes Princess Mononoke such an enduringly profound piece of work is that while Miyazaki is undoubtedly disgusted with the course of humanity, he nonetheless finds his misanthropy giving way to a sincere belief in the resilience of nature and the human spirit. You can see this in the film's ambiguous ending, when the Shishigami, a living manifestation of the cycle of life and death, threatens to envelope the land in darkness after its head is cut off by Lady Eboshi. But instead, from death comes new life, plants spring again, Ashitaka is healed, a lone Kadama survives, a reminder that nature was here before us and will persevere long after we're gone. He's not dead, Ashitaka tells San. He's here right now, trying to tell us something, that it's time for both of us to live. It is an echo of an enduring theme of Miyazaki's later work, a rallying call to children, and perhaps to himself, that no matter how bad the world gets, no matter how tempting it is to fall into fatalism or despair, you must keep on going. Life is suffering, Ashitaka is told by a man with leprosy, his face encased in bandages. It is hard. The world is cursed, but still you find reasons to keep living.